Picture this. It is the summer of 1970.
Okay.
You're high up in the Tahoe National Forest, and the air is just incredibly thin up there.
Oh, yeah. And it smells intensely of, like, baked pine needles and dry dust.
Exactly. And it is hot, like really, really hot. So you're standing there with a United States Forest Service trail crew, and you are watching them painstakingly cut a brand new length of the Pacific Crest Trail straight into the side of this granite and dirt mountain.
And when you say cut, you mean by hand.
By hand, yeah.
Yeah.
You're watching them swing Pulaski's, those half-axe, half-adze tools, along with heavy pickaxes and broad shovels.
Right.
They are moving massive boulders. They're chopping through thick root systems, leveling the grade so a hiker can walk it safely. I mean, it is back-breaking, sweat-drenched public labor.
Oh, absolutely.
And it's happening on public land, which you own, and it's being done to build a public asset for you to use.
I mean, that is just the absolute definition of a shared investment, right? Sweat equity poured directly into the dirt for the common good.
Exactly. So picture this crew. They finally finish this beautiful, pristine stretch of new trail tread. They step back, probably leaning on their shovels, wiping a layer of grime off their foreheads, just admiring the work.
Because it's perfect.
It's perfect. And then, over the ridge comes a permittee's band of sheep, hundreds of them.
Oh, man.
Yeah. The rancher holds permit to graze on this public land, and he drives the flock right down this freshly cut, hand-built tread.
Right over it.
Right over it. And in a matter of minutes, those hundreds of sharp digging hooves churn all that hard work, all that public labor, straight back into absolute dust. The trail is completely destroyed.
And the repair.
Well, the rancher just keeps walking, so the repair is just left for whoever comes next.
That is, I mean, it's such a visceral, almost infuriating image.
It really is.
And honestly, it's the perfectly devastating visual metaphor for the massive stack of sources we're analyzing today. Because that single incident in Tahoe in 1970, that is the macroeconomic reality of the American West distilled into one single cloud of dust. The public builds the asset. The public pays for the maintenance. And someone else entirely captures the value of the resource, walks away with the profit, and just leaves the bill behind.
Right. So today we are unpacking a mountain of source material. We've got proposed 2025 congressional bills, federal court dockets coming right out of Anchorage, environmental impact statements, and historical agency ledgers from the Department of the Interior.
That's a lot to get through.
It's a lot. And our mission today is to take all this data, all these dense bureaucratic maneuvers, and basically map out a live, real-time reckoning. Because today is Friday, June 26, 2026.
Right.
And the 150-year-old system built on that exact Tahoe trail dynamic is physically and legally straining under its own weight.
But, before we dive into these court cases and legislative battles, we really need to make something clear.
Yeah, good point.
Because our sources today touch on incredibly intense, ongoing political battles involving recent administrations, including, the Biden and Trump administrations, and sitting senators. So we want to state up front. We are not here to endorse any political side, candidate, or policy.
Definitely not.
We're looking at these events strictly through an analytical lens. Our job is to impartially extract the arguments from the source material, explain the underlying mechanisms of how these laws actually work, and lay out the landscape so you can understand what is happening to the public lands you own.
Right, because understanding the mechanism is everything. Okay, let's unpack this. Let's look at the historical ledger that brought us to 2026, because the sources lay out a century and a half of laws that lock in a system where the American public essentially subsidizes the extraction of its own resources.
And the numbers on that ledger are just staggering. Let's start with the General Mining Act of 1872.
Okay.
Under that law, hard rock minerals pulled from federal land pay exactly $0 in production royalties.
Wait, zero?
$0.
Yeah. So if a company pulls like gold, silver, copper, or lithium out of public soil, they don't pay the taxpayer a cut of the profits?
Not a single cent in federal royalties.
That's wild.
For a century and a half. And for context, if you drill for oil or mine for coal on federal land, you do pay a royalty. It's usually around 12.5 to 18%.
Right. That makes sense.
But hard rock minerals are governed by this 1872 law. It was signed by Ulysses S. Grant, and it was originally designed to encourage citizens to settle the western frontier.
To physically move people out west.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The mechanism of the law says that if you discover a valuable mineral deposit on public land, you have the right to mine it, free of charge.
So that's the first line item on the ledger. What's the second?
The 1934 Taylor Grazing Act framework. This governs how ranchers graze livestock on Bureau of Land Management, or BLM, lands.
Okay.
And the sources note that public land grazing fees have historically sat right around $1.35 per animal unit month.
Okay, stop there. Animal unit month. Because I see this term constantly in land management documents. Translate that for me. Are we talking about the cost to feed one single cow for 30 days?
Essentially, yes. An AUM, or animal unit month, is the amount of forage needed to sustain one cow and her calf, or say one horse, or 5 sheep, for a period of 1 month.
Got it.
So the federal government is charging roughly $1.35 for that month of feeding. Recently, it bumped up slightly, maybe to $1.69.
Okay.
But here is the critical context. If a rancher went to a private landowner in the West to lease grazing land, the market rate for that exact same AUM is often $20, $25, or even over $30.
Oh, wow. So the federal rate is just a microscopic fraction of the free market rate.
Exactly. It's a massive discount. Then look at the timber ledger. The sources highlight the Tongass National Forest Timber Program in Alaska, which has run roughly $1.7 billion in cumulative losses.
Wait, how does the government lose money selling trees? Timber is a really valuable commodity.
Right, but it's the mechanism of below-cost timber sales. To harvest timber in a remote, rugged place like the Tongass, which is a temperate rainforest spread across hundreds of islands, you have to build logging roads.
Sure.
And building roads through mountains and muskeg requires dynamite, heavy machinery, blasting gravel. It's incredibly expensive.
And the government pays for that.
The federal government often bears the administrative and infrastructural costs of preparing the sale and managing the road networks. So when you subtract the immense cost of getting to the trees from the price the timber companies actually pay for the wood, the taxpayer is often left deep in the red.
So we have zero royalties on minerals, deeply discounted grazing fees, and a timber program that just bleeds money.
Right.
What is the grand finale of this ledger?
The physical legacy. A roughly $50 billion cleanup tab for over 500,000 abandoned hard rock mines scattered across the country.
500,000 sites.
Over 500,000. And the sources point out that in 2018, the EPA actually declined to require active mining companies to post financial assurance up front to cover future cleanups.
Meaning, we aren't even forcing them to put money in escrow to ensure they clean up the mess when the mine eventually closes.
No.
Which guarantees the public is on the hook. So if you're listening to this right now, you might be thinking, okay, that is a deeply frustrating history lesson about how the West was won and paid for. But our mission today is to show you that this is not history.
Not at all.
This is not some academic retrospective. We are watching 4 massive historic threads colliding simultaneously across 2025 and 2026.
Yeah, we're going to walk you through a staggering legislative push to sell off public land entirely. We're going to examine a rare, unprecedented government veto of a mega mine being tested in an Anchorage courtroom literally this week.
It's all happening right now.
Exactly. We'll look at the massive tug-of-war in Congress between reforming these 19th century mining laws versus completely deregulating them, and we will track the fierce rollback of modern conservation rules.
And as we promised, we are going to look at the strongest arguments on all sides of this. We have to give the pro-development side its full and fair weight, because the decisions being made right now, the precedents being set in these courtrooms, they're going to determine what the physical map of the United States looks like for the next century.
Absolutely.
So let's move right into that first thread, the ultimate privatization. Because for 150 years, the government kept the actual land but gave away the resources on it. You know, the grass, the timber, the minerals. But looking at these 2025 congressional documents, the logic has taken its final, perhaps inevitable step.
Right.
We aren't just talking about giving away the resources anymore. We are looking at attempts to sell the dirt itself.
And this brings us to June of 2025 in the 119th Congress. Senator Mike Lee of Utah, who chairs the incredibly powerful Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, made a procedural move that shocked a lot of public lands watchers.
Yeah, I remember reading this.
He inserted a mandate into a budget reconciliation bill to force the sale of federal public land.
And looking at the acreage numbers in these documents, we are not talking about auctioning off a few empty dirt lots on the edge of town.
No, the initial scope was breathtaking. It was reported to target up to roughly 3.3 million acres of BLM and Forest Service land across 11 western states.
3.3 million acres. Just to help you visualize that, that is larger than the entire state of Connecticut, just tossed onto the auction block.
It's massive.
And the stated rationale for this, which the sources say ties back to Senator Lee's earlier Houses Act framing, was that selling this land would solve the housing supply crisis.
That was the argument. The premise is that the federal government holds vast tracts of underused acreage adjacent to growing western municipalities. Towns in Utah, Nevada, and Idaho are landlocked by federal property.
Right, they can't physically grow.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the logic goes, if we force the sale of this land to local governments or developers, they can build residential subdivisions, the supply of homes will skyrocket, and housing prices will come down.
It's fascinating how this completely shifts the paradigm of what public land is even for, because for a century and a half, the model was 19th century resource extraction. You go onto the public land, you take the gold, you graze the sheep, you cut the timber, but the land itself remains public.
Right. The deed stays with the government.
Yeah. You and I still own the forest, even if the trees are temporarily gone. We can still camp there. But this 2025 push, this is a pivot to 21st century real estate liquidation. It's stating that the highest and best value of public land isn't multiple use, it isn't conservation, it isn't even extraction, it's residential real estate.
It's the permanent privatization of the asset.
Exactly.
What's fascinating here is how it fundamentally alters the ownership structure. Once the land is sold and a subdivision is built, it's gone. It is removed from the public trust forever. You can't hike on it. You can't hunt elk on it. You can't manage it for watershed health. It is private property, fenced and gated.
Reading through this, an analogy came to mind. It's like, we, the American public, have been renting out a fully furnished, beautiful mansion to tenants for absolute pennies.
Okay, I like this.
And the tenants keep taking the furniture. They take the antique chairs, the paintings, the silk, that's the gold, the timber, the grass. But it's actually worse than that. While they're taking the furniture, they're also operating a makeshift chemical lab in the basement, and they leave toxic sludge leaking into the foundation.
That's the abandoned mines.
Exactly. And instead of looking at this and saying, hey, maybe we should raise the rent or bill you for the antique chairs or make you clean up the basement, the government is now just looking at the tenant and saying, hey, want to buy the deed to the whole toxic house for $1.
That captures the escalation perfectly, because it moves from socializing the cost of an ongoing operation to simply forfeiting the underlying asset completely. But, this plan to sell the mansion didn't exactly sail through the Senate, did it?
It didn't. It hit two massive walls. One was procedural, and one was a political earthquake. Let's start with the procedural wall, because to understand what happened in June 2025, we really have to explain the mechanism of a budget reconciliation bill.
This is crucial. So in the United States Senate, most major legislation requires 60 votes to overcome a filibuster. And in a deeply divided government, getting 60 votes is nearly impossible.
Basically a miracle.
Right. However, there is a special legislative process called budget reconciliation. It was created to streamline bills that deal directly with federal spending, revenues, and the debt limit. The magic of a reconciliation bill is that it bypasses the filibuster entirely. You only need a simple majority, 51 votes, or 50 plus the vice president to pass it.
Which makes it the most coveted vehicle in Washington. Everyone wants to attach their pet project to a reconciliation bill. But there is a catch, right?
A huge catch, known as the Byrd Rule, named after the late Senator Robert Byrd. The Byrd Rule dictates that everything inside a reconciliation bill must be strictly, mathematically related to the federal budget. You cannot use this filibuster-proof vehicle to sneak sweeping policy changes into law.
Okay.
If a provision's impact on the budget is merely incidental to a larger policy goal, it is considered extraneous. In Washington parlance, they actually call these violations bird droppings.
Bird droppings. That is incredible. And there is an actual referee who gets to decide what is and isn't a bird dropping, right?
Yes. The nonpartisan Senate parliamentarian, currently Elizabeth McDonough, she acts as the umpire. And on June 23rd or 24th, 2025, she stepped in. The parliamentarian looked at Senator Lee's mandate to sell 3.3 million acres of public land and ruled that the massive policy shift of privatizing that much acreage vastly outweighed the mere budgetary revenue of the land sales.
So it violated the Byrd Rule.
Exactly. It was extraneous.
So Senator Lee's team had to scramble. The sources show they tried to narrow the provisions significantly to sneak it past the parliamentarian. They took the Forest Service land out of it entirely, leaving only BLM land. They dropped the total acreage down to somewhere between 1.05 and 2.1 million acres.
Right.
And they added a caveat limiting the sales to land within about 5 miles of existing population centers.
Which we should note is still a colossal amount of land. I mean, over 1 million acres is still the size of Rhode Island.
Right.
But then they hit the second wall, and this wasn't an obscure Senate procedure. This was a massive bipartisan public revolt.
I was reading the news coverage in the sources from those few days in late June. It was wild. Because public lands in the American West aren't just some abstract concept debated in a committee room. That's where people actually live their lives.
Yeah.
Had this incredible organic coalition form almost overnight. Hunters, fly fishing guides, off-road ATV enthusiasts, hikers, conservationists, and crucially, at least 4 Republican senators pushed back forcefully against their own committee chairman.
Because if you're a working-class elk hunter in Idaho, or you spend your weekends riding dirt bikes on BLM trails in Utah, that federal land is effectively your backyard. You rely on it for recreation and tradition.
Absolutely.
The absolute last thing you want is to drive your truck up to your favorite historic trailhead one Saturday morning, only to find a new luxury subdivision, a paved cul-de-sac, and a bright red no trespassing sign.
The pushback was so intense that on June 28, 2025, Senator Lee withdrew the provision entirely. But I noticed his reasoning was very specific. He didn't say he was wrong. He cited the fact that under the tight procedural constraints of a reconciliation bill, he couldn't legally guarantee that the land would only be sold to American buyers.
Right, that was a big sticking point.
He warned he couldn't prevent foreign corporations or geopolitical adversaries from buying up millions of acres of Western real estate.
What's fascinating here is the vital takeaway from this thread. He withdrew it for procedural and security reasons, but he explicitly signaled that a standalone bill to mandate these sales would be coming in the future.
So it's not over.
Far from it. The attempt in 2025 was defeated, but the ideological push to monetize and sell public lands remains entirely alive.
And to understand the momentum behind that push, we really have to look at what was happening administratively at the exact same time. While Congress was debating selling the land, the Department of the Interior was actively rolling back the Bureau of Land Management's Public Lands Rule,
also known formally as the Conservation and Landscape Health Rule. To understand why its rollback is so significant, you have to look at the mechanism of how the BLM operates.
Okay.
By law, specifically the Federal Land Policy and Management Act of 1976, the BLM has a multiple-use mandate. They have to balance grazing, mining, energy development, recreation, and wildlife. But historically, the extractive uses mining, oil, and grazing have heavily dominated how the landscape is treated. The BLM essentially operated as a permitting agency for extraction.
But the Public Lands Rule, which was finalized during the Biden administration, tried to change that math.
Exactly. It was an attempt to officially, legally put conservation on an equal footing with extraction. The mechanism was creating conservation leases. It allowed the BLM to look at a pristine ecosystem and say, leaving this landscape intact, managing it for wildlife corridors or watershed health is just as legally valid a use as leasing it for a copper mine or a cattle herd.
But the current administration, driven by the Unleash agenda, moved aggressively to kill that rule.
They did.
The sources show that in September 2025, the Interior Department published a proposal to rescind it, and then just last month, in May 2026, they finalized the full rescission.
And the data point in the sources that truly jumps out is the public response during the mandatory comment period. When the government proposed rescinding this rule, they received hundreds of thousands of public comments. Roughly 98% of those comments urged the government to keep the conservation rule in place. 98%.
That is staggering. 98% of the public says, please protect this land, please prioritize landscape health, and the government rolls it back anyway, right alongside a congressional attempt to just sell millions of acres outright.
It's a very clear direction.
It paints a vivid picture of a system accelerating toward total privatization and maximum extraction. But that brings us to the second thread of our deep dive. Because if the land sell-off fight is about doubling down on giving public resources away, this next case is the exact opposite.
Right?
It is the ultimate test of whether the public actually has the legal power to stand up and say no.
We are shifting our focus from the halls of Congress to the remote headwaters of Bristol Bay in Alaska. We are talking about the Pebble Mine. And what is playing out right now, literally, the oral arguments were yesterday, June 25, 2026, in a federal courtroom in Anchorage, is absolutely unprecedented.
I was reading the background on Bristol Bay, and the asymmetry of this conflict just blew my mind. I want to unpack the geography and the economics here because it is the crux of the whole debate.
Let's do it.
On one side, you have the proposed Pebble Mine, backed by a Canadian company called Northern Dynasty Minerals, and their U.S. arm, the Pebble Limited Partnership. It's this massive, undeveloped porphyry deposit of copper, gold, and molybdenum.
And it's sitting directly underneath the headwaters of the Nushagak and Kivishak rivers, which flow straight into Bristol Bay.
And Bristol Bay is not just a scenic body of water. It is home to the world's largest wild sockeye salmon run. The numbers are almost hard to comprehend.
Tens of millions of salmon.
Yeah, tens of millions return there every year. It supports a pristine ecosystem, centuries-old indigenous cultures, and a commercial and sport fishery that generates billions of dollars and supports thousands and thousands of jobs.
So here is the fundamental economic clash. A mine, by its very definition, is a one-time extraction of a finite resource. You dig the hole, you blast the rock, you crush the ore, you take the copper and gold, you sell it, and eventually, whether it's 20 years or 50 years, the mine is empty.
It's just a hole in the ground.
Exactly. The value is extracted and gone. On the other side, you have a renewable, sustainable asset, a wild salmon fishery. Because of the salmon's life cycle, if you do not destroy their spawning habitat, they will return from the ocean every single year.
Like clockwork.
Yes. They will continue to feed people, support thousands of jobs, and drive the local economy literally forever. It is an infinitely renewable economic engine.
Unless
An externality breaks the cycle. To extract microscopic flecks of copper from a low-grade porphyry deposit, you have to crush billions of tons of rock. This creates a toxic slurry called tailings, which often contains sulfides that create acid mine drainage when exposed to air and water.
And you have to put that somewhere.
This highly toxic waste must be stored behind massive earthen dams forever, literally, in perpetuity. If that externality, that toxic waste, leaks, or if a dam breaches and flows into the watershed, you've essentially converted an infinitely renewable billion-dollar salmon asset into a permanent toxic liability.
And usually, under the 150-year-old system we outlined earlier, the way this works is highly predictable. We permit the mine, we allow the extraction to happen, we cross our fingers and trust the engineers that the tailings dam won't break.
Right.
And then decades later, when the company has declared bankruptcy and the dam inevitably leaks, we act completely surprised when the $50 billion cleanup bill arrives for the taxpayer and the fishery is dead.
But Pebble was different. The sources detail a monumental agency action. In January 2023, the Environmental Protection Agency did something incredibly rare. They invoked their authority under Section 404C of the Clean Water Act.
Okay, let's explain what Section 404 actually is, because this sounds highly technical. What does 404 regulate?
Section 404 of the Clean Water Act regulates the discharge of dredge and fill material into the navigable waters of the United States, including wetlands.
Yeah.
When a mining company builds a tailings dam or dumps waste rock into a valley, legally, that waste is classified as fill material. Usually, the Army Corps of Engineers issues a 404 permit to allow this, provided the company mitigates the damage. But Section 404C grants the EPA a specific veto power. The EPA administrator can step in and say, no, the discharge of this fill material will have an unacceptable adverse effect on municipal water supplies, shellfish beds, or fishery areas.
So the EPA looked at Pebble and dropped the 404C veto.
Yes. But here is the critical part that sparked the massive lawsuit. They vetoed it before the final permits were even fully adjudicated.
Wow.
They issued a final determination that effectively prohibited the disposal of mine waste in the Bristol Bay watershed for the Pebble deposit based on the projected footprint of the mine.
I couldn't wrap my head around this when I was reading the source documents.
Yeah.
How does the ETA legally justify preempting the process? To a layperson, if you see a car driving full speed toward a cliff, obviously you hit the brakes.
Right.
You don't let it crash and then say, wow, we should build a better ambulance. Why is it so rare for the government to step in early before the damage is done?
Because the entire regulatory framework of the United States, especially under the 1872 mining law, is built on the absolute presumption of development. The default answer for federal land agencies is yes.
Always yes.
The system is designed to figure out how to permit a mine, how to mitigate the inevitable damage, what size the dam should be, not whether to permit it at all. Using 404C preemptively violently flips that script. It asserts that some places, like Bristol Bay, are simply too ecologically valuable, too vulnerable to ever be mined safely.
And obviously, a multinational mining corporation with billions of dollars of copper in the ground did not just pack up their briefcases and go home.
Far from it. Northern Dynasty, the Pebble Limited Partnership, the state of Alaska, and two village corporations. The Alaska Peninsula Corporation and Iliamna Natives Limited all filed massive lawsuits against the EPA.
What was their main argument?
They argued this was egregious government overreach. They argued that the EPA exceeded its statutory authority under the Clean Water Act, and that by dropping this veto early, They unlawfully preempted a rigorous permitting process that should have been allowed to play out to the end.
Which sets the stage for the showdown happening right now. And here is where the politics in the source documents take a wild turn. Because in mid-2025, there were heavy settlement talks between the mining company and the EPA. Everyone in the conservation world was holding their breath, wondering if the new administration was just going to fold, withdraw the veto, and let the mine go forward.
But they didn't fold. In a massive, unexpected twist, the Trump administration's Department of Justice filed a brief in February 2026, just a few months ago, backing the EPA veto.
Wait, really?
Yeah. The DOJ formally argued in federal court that the agency properly acted within its authority to prevent unacceptable harm to the Bristol Bay fishery. And when that DOJ brief dropped, Northern Dynasty stock plummeted instantly.
Just pause and think about the gravity of that. You have the Trump DOJ defending a Biden-era EPA veto against a massive mining corporation. That alone tells you how astronomically high the ecological stakes are for Bristol Bay.
Which brings us to yesterday, June 25, 2026. The U.S. District Court for the District of Alaska, right in Anchorage. The summary judgment cross motions were argued.
Just to clarify, summary judgment cross motions. That means both sides are looking at the judge and saying, we don't need a massive jury trial to argue over facts. We agree on what happened. We just need you to rule on whether the law allows the EPA to do this.
Exactly. It's a pure question of legal authority. The judge is listening to both sides, and a ruling that will echo across the entire mining industry is expected later this year.
So if we look back at our 150-year ledger, why is this Anchorage courtroom the central lens for this whole deep dive?
Because Pebble is the ultimate stress test of our entire thesis. If that EPA veto holds up in federal court, it sets a monumental precedent. It proves that the public actually has the legal right to refuse an extraction.
It proves we can say no.
It proves we do not have to socialize the risk every single time. But if the veto falls, if the court rules the EPA overstepped and cannot preemptively stop a mine, it violently reinforces the 150-year-old norm. It confirms that under American law, the public must wait, let the extraction proceed, risk the renewable resource, and pay the catastrophic bill later.
It is a phenomenal cliffhanger. And while the fate of one specific megamine is hanging in the balance in an Anchorage courtroom, the fate of the entire underlying system is being fought over in the halls of Congress.
Yes, the larger battle.
Which brings us to our third thread, the crossroads. We are looking at an outright legislative war between two completely opposing visions. On one side, a push for historic reform of the 1872 law. On the other, a massive executive push known as the Unleash Agenda.
Let's start with the push for reform, because it directly targets the empty ledger we outlined at the very beginning. The sources detail a major bill from March 2025, the Mining Waste, Fraud, and Abuse Prevention Act of 2025.
Right.
It was introduced by Senator Ben Rassajan of New Mexico and the late Representative Raul Grijalva of Arizona.
And we should note, as the documents show, Representative Grijalva actually passed away just days after introducing the House companion bill. This sweeping reform effort was essentially one of the final legislative acts of his very long career.
And the bill is incredibly comprehensive. It aims to completely overhaul the 1872 General Mining Act. First and foremost, it would finally impose a federal production royalty on hard rock minerals.
So no more free extraction.
Exactly. If you take gold, copper, or lithium off public land, you finally pay the taxpayer a cut, ending 150 years of free extraction. Second, it would charge annual rental fees for mining claims, treating mining companies the same way we treat ski resorts or telecommunication towers on public lands.
Because right now, under the 1872 law, they basically just stake a claim and hold it for next to nothing.
Right. Third, and perhaps most importantly, it would permanently end the practice of patenting.
Okay, let's unpack patenting, because to most people, a patent is something you get for inventing a new microchip or a better mousetrap. It sounds bizarre to patent a mountain. How does this mechanism work?
In the context of the 1872 mining law, patenting is a mechanism of privatization. If a prospector or a company can prove they have made a valuable mineral discovery on federal public land and they invest a minimal amount of labor, the law allows them to literally buy the absolute title to the land from the federal government for just $2.50 to $5 an acre.
$5 an acre? That's not a lease. They own the land outright.
They own it outright. It privatizes the land completely, removing it from the public domain. Now, to be fair, Congress has placed a temporary year-by-year moratorium on patenting since the mid-1990s through annual appropriations bills.
But it's temporary.
Right. But this 2025 reform bill would end the practice permanently by statute.
So the land forever stays public.
Yes. And finally, the bill creates a hard rock minerals reclamation fund. It proposes taking a portion of those new royalties and rental fees and dedicating them specifically to cleaning up that $50 billion backlog of 500,000 abandoned toxic mines.
So if we look at everything we've talked about, the zero royalties, the free land through patenting, the toxic cleanups, this reform bill is essentially the legislative embodiment of a very simple, rational idea. Make the price reflect the true cost. Stop the wealth transfer.
Precisely. It attempts to finally balance the ledger. But pulling violently in the exact opposite direction is the administration's current executive focus, the unleash agenda.
Meaning unleash domestic mining and resource extraction.
Right. The sources detail how the current administration is pushing a slew of executive actions and permitting overhauls designed to aggressively fast-track the extraction of copper, lithium, rare earths, and other strategic minerals.
And what's the reasoning there?
The framing around this is entirely based on supply chain security and reducing America's dependence on foreign adversaries, primarily China, for the materials needed for the energy transition.
And reading through these administrative dockets, it's clear that to achieve this fast-tracking, they aren't just speeding up the paperwork in a back office. They are actively dismantling decades-old conservation rules on the ground.
The most glaring example in our sources is the rescission of the 2001 roadless rule. In the summer of 2025, USDA Secretary Brooke Rollins announced the formal intent to rescind this rule, which protects the last remaining wild, unroaded areas of our national forests from commercial development.
Let's explain the mechanism of the roadless rule, because it's not just about keeping cars out of the woods.
The roadless area conservation rule was enacted to stop the bleeding of below-cost timber sales. We talked earlier about how building logging roads costs the taxpayer millions. The rule simply said, in these specific pristine areas of the National Forest System, you cannot use federal money to blast new commercial logging roads.
And that stops the logging.
By stopping the roads, you effectively stop industrial-scale clear-cutting because the timber companies can't access the trees. Rescinding this rule means reopening roughly 45 million acres of public land to road building and commercial timber harvesting.
Including, crucially, the Tongass National Forest in Alaska.
Yes. The draft environmental impact statement, expected later in 2026, targets reopening about 9.3 million acres of the Tongass.
Wow.
When you blast a logging road through a steep, rainy ecosystem like the Tongass, you inevitably cause landslides and severe erosion. The silt washes into the streams, suffocating the gravel beds where salmon lay their eggs. Erasing the roadless rule is not a minor policy tweak. It is the dismantling of one of those significant conservation achievements of the last quarter century.
So what does this all mean? As I'm connecting the dots here, a really frustrating picture emerges. We have a 150-year-old mining law from 1872 and a 90-year-old grazing law from 1934. How have these ancient statutes completely trapped modern policy?
It's a structural bind.
It seems like we have created a bizarre system where aggressive deregulation, like wiping out a 25-year-old conservation rule or erasing the public lands rule across tens of millions of acres, is legally so much easier than just implementing common sense pricing and charging a royalty.
That is exactly the structural trap we are caught in. The 1872 law was written when the federal government's primary existential goal was to settle the western frontier. It was designed to literally give the land and minerals away to encourage citizens to move west.
And it hasn't changed.
Because that law is still on the books, unamended in its core economic provisions, it acts as an absolute legal trump card. Federal land management agencies are bound by it. So when a modern administration decides they want to boost domestic mineral production, they cannot easily tweak the economics.
Right.
They can't mandate a royalty or demand a higher price. Only Congress can change the 1872 law, and Congress is gridlocked. What the executive branch can do, however, through their own agency rulemaking, is clear the regulatory path. They can unilaterally remove environmental hurdles, rescind the conservation rules, and mandate shorter permitting timelines. The unyielding nature of the 1872 law makes environmental deregulation the absolute path of least resistance.
Which brings us to a really critical moment in this deep dive. Up until now, we've been pretty hard on the current system. We've talked about the missing money, the environmental damage, the massive subsidies, the toxic sludge. But a deep dive that only indicts one side of a massive complex issue is just propaganda.
It's intellectually incomplete.
Exactly. We absolutely have to pause our momentum here and look at the absolute strongest arguments for maintaining this historical system of low cost and high extraction. Because the people defending this system, the ranchers, the miners, the local politicians, they are not cartoon villains trying to destroy the planet.
No, not at all.
They have real, substantial, existential arguments that deserve a completely fair hearing. Let's look at the pro-development case. What is their strongest argument?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the most immediate and tangible argument is about human beings. It's about jobs, survival, and the stark reality of the rural American West. In many remote counties in Nevada, Wyoming, Alaska, and Idaho, mining, grazing, and timber aren't just one of many industries. They are the absolute economic spine of the entire community.
If the mine closes, the town essentially closes.
Literally. These are often isolated places with very few alternative economic drivers. There isn't a tech hub down the street. The local tax base, the funding for the public schools, the resources to keep the rural hospital open, it all relies heavily on the tax revenue and the high-paying blue-collar jobs generated by resource extraction.
And reform puts that at risk.
When reformers in Washington, D.C. talk enthusiastically about adding an 8% gross production royalty, plus annual land rentals, plus a massive reformation fee to a mining operation, well, you have to remember that mining is a highly volatile global commodity business with very tight margins. Adding all those new federal costs overnight could easily make marginal, lower-grade ore bodies unprofitable.
And if they become unprofitable, the parent company shuts them down.
And when they shut down, generational working landscapes turn into ghost towns. And this ties directly into a deep historical federalism grievance that is very real for Westerners. Western states host a vastly disproportionate amount of federal land compared to the East Coast.
Just to give some scale, Nevada is what, over 80% federal land?
Nearly 85% of Nevada is owned by the federal government. Utah is over 60%. Idaho is over 60%. Meanwhile, states like New York or Connecticut have almost zero federal public land.
So the control is all in D.C.
Right. So you have distant federal agencies in Washington, D.C. making sweeping decisions about royalties, grazing fees, and roadless rules. And those decisions have outsized, sometimes devastating impacts on local Western livelihoods. The local argument is that the original statutes, the 1872 mining law, the Taylor-Grazing Act, were meant to empower citizens to settle and develop a working landscape, not to turn the federal government into an absentee landlord squeezing every penny of profit out of local workers.
And they see themselves as stewards too, right?
Furthermore, ranchers and timber communities will argue vehemently that they are active stewards of the land, not just extractors. Cattle ranchers manage wildfire risk by reducing fuel loads. Timber crews maintain access roads used for firefighting.
That is a powerful human argument. It's about community survival. But as I read the sources on the Unleash agenda, there is a second major pillar to the pro-development case, and it goes far beyond the economics of a local mining town. It's about global security and the offshoring dilemma.
This is perhaps the most strategically critical argument in 2026. We are currently in the middle of a massive global energy transition and an intense geopolitical competition. Copper, lithium, cobalt, rare earth elements. These are the non-negotiable building blocks of modern technology.
You literally need them.
You cannot build electric vehicles, high-capacity batteries, advanced grid infrastructure, or military defense systems without them. They are genuinely vital for national security.
And the global demand for these specific critical metals is skyrocketing.
Right. Exponentially. So here is the brutal dilemma. If the United States refuses to mine these materials domestically, if we applaud the EPA for blocking the Pebble Mine because we want to protect the pristine Bristol Bay, or if we layer on years of new regulations, NEPA reviews, and new royalty costs that make domestic mining entirely unattractive to global investors, the global demand for that copper and lithium does not magically vanish.
We still buy the iPhones. We still build the massive offshore wind turbines. We still demand the electric cars.
Exactly. We just import the minerals instead. And where do we import them from? Often from jurisdictions with vastly weaker environmental protections and abysmal labor standards. By refusing to mine at home, we rapidly increase our reliance on fragile supply chains dominated by foreign adversaries. China, for example, processes a massive percentage of the world's critical minerals.
Let's do a thought experiment here because it really brings the tension into focus for me. Are we as a wealthy nation just practicing a massive global version of NIMBYism, Not in my backyard.
That's the question.
If we say, no, we strictly refuse to dig a massive hole in Alaska or Nevada because we want to save our beautiful landscapes, but then we turn right around and buy the exact same ton of copper from a country that uses child labor or dumps toxic tailings directly into their rivers with zero environmental regulation, are we actually saving the planet? Or are we just outsourcing our environmental guilt? Are we keeping our own hands clean while directly funding devastation somewhere else?
That is the exact potent argument made by the mining industry and the architects of the Unleash agenda. Slowing domestic permitting or raising costs doesn't stop global mining. It merely offshores the environmental damage to a dirtier jurisdiction while keeping our voracious metal demand intact. It's a very serious empirical point.
Yeah.
The honest reform position must answer these arguments. The rural job impacts and the brutal reality of offshoring it cannot just wave them off as corporate greed.
Okay. We have laid the entire landscape out. We've looked at the $50 billion toxic cleanup tab, the aggressive attempts to sell off millions of acres of public land for real estate, the unprecedented Pebble Mine veto hanging by a thread in Alaska, the legislative push for reform, and we've just given the absolute strongest defense of the current pro-development system.
We've covered a lot of ground.
It is time for the verdict. We have to bring this entire argument full circle. Having given the development case its full, fair weight, looking at all the numbers in these ledgers, I have to ask you, does the system finally balance?
I will say this, as calmly and measuredly as possible, looking strictly at the economics. Take the development case at its absolute strongest, give it every possible benefit of the doubt regarding local jobs and national security, and the ledger still fails. It does not balance.
Walk me through why. Because the offshoring argument makes a lot of sense on paper.
It does. But we have to separate the need for the resource from the pricing of the resource. Because the core objection to the system we have traced over these last 150 years is not that the American West produces minerals or beef or timber. We absolutely need those things. The objection is the pricing.
The economics.
It is the fundamental warped economics of the arrangement. A system that extracts a finite, highly valuable resource with a royalty of exactly $0. A system that charges a grazing fee at a microscopic fraction of the private market rate, a system that runs a timber program, bleeding billions of taxpayer dollars to build logging roads, and a system that hands a $50 billion toxic cleanup bill to the American public that is not a free market.
That's the catchphrase, right? Politicians and industry groups love to use the term free market when defending these extractive industries against regulation.
But it is a complete myth in this context. A true, functional free market requires that the price of a good accurately reflects the total cost of producing it. It requires that the liability for an externality like a toxic tailings spill or a degraded watershed is assigned directly to the private party that creates it, not socialized onto the public ledger.
Right.
What the 1872 mining law, the 1934 Taylor Grazing Act, and the below-cost timber frameworks actually run is a massive structural wealth transfer.
Here's where it gets really interesting. It's a wealth transfer from the public to the private sector.
Yes. The financial gains of extraction are highly privatized. They go directly to the shareholders of the mining companies and the permit holders. But the losses, the infrastructural costs, and the catastrophic long-term risks are fully socialized. They are carried by you, the taxpayer. And that externality isn't just a neat economic theory. It is made physical right now in the 500,000 abandoned hard rock mines leaking heavy metals into Western watersheds.
But what about the strongest point we just discussed, the offshoring argument? If we raise the price, if we implement a royalty, don't we just push the mining to dirtier countries?
The offshoring threat is empirically real. But the logical economic solution to that threat is not to artificially price domestic resources at zero. The solution is to price the true cost into domestic mining, ensure the environmental standards are met, and then use robust trade policy like targeted tariffs or carbon border adjustments to demand the exact same rigorous standards of our imports.
So you level it globally.
You level the global playing field by raising the floor globally, not by lowering our own domestic standards to the basement just to compete with unregulated regimes.
So national security absolutely justifies the pressing need for domestic mining.
But national security does not justify mining for free. It does not justify socializing a $50 billion cleanup cost.
Connecting all these threads, this is where it really hits home for me. When you look at what has happened in just the last 12 to 18 months, the cascading events of 2025 and 2026 detailed in these sources, you realize this isn't an academic debate being held in a university economics department anymore. The system is physically straining under its own weight.
It's happening right now.
We saw a powerful United States senator come a hair's breadth from trying to sell off millions of acres of public land outright because the extraction logic has naturally evolved into real estate liquidation. We saw a modern popular conservation rule erased by the stroke of a pen despite 98% of the public begging the government to keep it. And pointing in the exact opposite direction, we have a rare, fragile federal veto of a mega mine hanging by a thread in an Anchorage courtroom.
The historical contradictions of the system are finally colliding. The bill, which has been deferred and rolled over for 150 years, is visibly coming due. And the country is deciding in real time right now whether to finally pay it down through structural pricing reform or just roll it forward one more time through total deregulation and giveaway.
Which brings us right back to where we started today. I want you to close your eyes and put yourself back on that mountain in the summer of 1970, the Tahoe National Forest. The air is hot. The pine needles are baking. You can see the trail crew wiping the sweat from their eyes, looking down at that beautiful hand-cut stretch of the Pacific Crest Trail. Public land, public labor, a public asset built for everyone to enjoy.
And then the band of sheep comes over the ridge.
Hundreds of hooves churning the tread, kicking up a massive cloud of dust, destroying the work in minutes. The permittee drives them through, captures the value of the grass, and leaves the ruined trail for whoever comes next. That one moment in Tahoe holds the entire thesis of everything we've discussed today. The public builds the infrastructure, the public absorbs the risk, the public pays the cleanup bill, and someone else walks off with the use and the profit.
The ledger is open for everyone to see now. A system that prices public resources near zero and hands the public the bill is not a free market, it is a transfer.
It is. The true cost of this transfer is finally visible, to the point where outright sell-offs of the land itself are being put on the table in Congress. So we want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, a question to explore on your own. Now that the math is undeniable and the stakes in places like Bristol Bay are this high, what happens to the American relationship with the outdoors? Will the public finally demand a receipt for its resources? Or is that next band of sheep going to be the last one to walk down a truly public trail?
It's been an absolute privilege doing this deep dive.
Always a pleasure. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you on the next one.